A very good evening to all of you, and we are ready to commence the panel discussion on well-being in the cyber age. Let me introduce the panelists today at the panel discussion. Professor Priyanjali D'Souza, clinical psychologist, Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo. Mr. Jayantha Fernando, chairman of the National Center for Cybersecurity, director and legal advisor of in ICT. And we have Dr. Kazun D'Souza with us, a senior lecturer of University of Colombo School of Computing, who's also an expert on cybersecurity. So meanwhile, we already had a few sessions, and I have with me the questions that you gave from each of your groups, 2 from each group. So let me start with the first question, and that would be from group number 1. With regards to, the topic was on cyberbullying. So let me start with the first question, and I'll be giving out this question to Mr. Jayantha Fernando, as this is probably related to social media and also your privacy information. The question being, why social network asks for privacy information and do not keep them private?
So thank you very much for the opportunity to come together at this session, and I congratulate the University of Colombo in the first instance for hosting the Asia Pacific event of this magnitude, bringing all eminent universities together. In terms of the session, I think it's in the context of modern day technology and its use. I think we need to congratulate the participants and the organizers for this particular session looking at the well-being in the cyber age. So thank you for doing that. To get straight into your question, basically from the moderator about the privacy measures built into social media and whether they will be honored or not. It's a very interesting issue and a challenge, because simply that we all know when we look at the platform services and the services we use in the social media domain, when we in the first instance register using our tab or mobile or whatever to be a user, we tick off terms and conditions under which we agree to carry out certain functions vis-a-vis that platform. So there is a contractual relationship created between the user and the provider of that service. And within the terms and conditions, you have privacy and other safeguards built in. But often what happens is that it's one-way traffic. One-way traffic in this sense, I mean, not to put any blame on anybody, but it so happens that if we abuse or if we misuse our rights and obligations within the framework of that contract we enter into with the provider of that platform or the solution provider, the solution provider can take us out. They can give us some kind of warning, kind of signals to say that we are either behaving or misbehaving. That happens. But when it comes to our privacy and whether they would keep to the privacy commitments that we sign off, and sometimes we can go to the settings and enhance our privacy to decide whether we want to share certain information only with family, with a very close friends group, or the public at large. You can control all that. However, the bottom line is that I have seen that most social media platforms, or absolutely all of them, would like to respect that. However, we know that there are instances where matters are beyond their control, and there is breach. There are wide-scale breaches happening, and we know all of them in the recent times. Kasun can talk a little about it, and the social media breaches have resulted in profiles, details of profiles, upload information, and even passwords details of our account information going outside the control of the operator, what we call data breach incidents. Now, because of the fact that some countries and jurisdictions where these operators basically have their main offices, either they are incorporated in the state of California and they have a large office perhaps in Brussels or Ireland or some other European destination, and they are governed by rules and regulations that require disclosure, that breach is notified with a worldwide announcement, and the customer is sometimes notified. But what I have noticed, at least in cases that I have seen in South Asia, our users who have suffered a breach are not specifically notified. So the curing of the damage is done by that company, because they have a social responsibility to do it. Very often they do it in a very nice way so that we don't get scared about what has happened. But in terms of whether they will keep to the commitments is not just a contract issue, it's a technology issue. And I think perhaps Kasun can take over from there and explain the technology challenges in running those platforms, which makes it impossible sometimes for them to keep to the contractual obligations the platform provider enters into with us to keep to the privacy obligations that we have signed up.
All right, we are moving on to the next question. With the time, I have to pick the best out of the best. As the next question would be on telehealth. Is it possible that patients opt for the telehealth instead of going to the hospital, even in some dangerous cases? I would like to point out the question to Professor Priyanjali Desai, sir.
So telehealth services were actually started for rural communities initially. So for example, if say in countries where there's a wide geographical area and people can't access health services, you could provide health services from the central hospital through the internet. So for example, if there are no hospitals outside of Colombo, from the national hospital, we might be able to provide some kinds of consultations to people living in rural villages, provided that they also have a computer or a smartphone or a Wi-Fi connection. However, if the patient needs surgical operations, clearly you can't do it through telehealth services. It's just a consultation. Now, the dangerous cases come if somebody is, for example, suicidal or homicidal. So would they then not go for a face-to-face consultation and instead want to connect with somebody through the telehealth portal? It can happen. It can happen due to many reasons, but the positive is at least they're connected. Through even a dangerous case, they're connected through some portal. And if the person is suicidal or homicidal, once a connection is made with the central hospital or a health consultant, they can then decide what to do with that person. So it doesn't mean that just because somebody is dangerous, they will opt only to go for telehealth. Mostly people do want to get into a face-to-face consultation. So this kind of situation is very rare.
Yes, hope you received the answer for the question. Group number 3? Yes. And then I'm going for the question by group number 4. This is to Dr. Kasun Desai, sir. Can AI tech detect or identify depressing words or pictures like they do on hashtags or comments or posts without invading privacy?
Depression and stuff like that.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this session. So the question is, can kind of we mine the data, or kind of we could identify whatever the personal, emotional things based on their images without going for privacy breaches. That question is kind of, it's depend. Like for example, when you post the photos, so people might post those images. Maybe you post it, maybe someone else post it, but some situations perhaps yes. So these posts may violate your privacy because it shows your emotional levels in which stage and so on. But in sometimes you may post it maybe, but for the whatever the social networks, but whether it violates your privacy or not depend on how kind of you define the privacy. Because for me, I personally feel some information is private for me. Some other person might think it's a public kind of. And the main thing what I would like to highlight there is, if someone concerned on the privacy, which connect to the first question as well. So technology always there to kind of protect the cybersecurity, plus to do the data mining and things like that. So in order to use those technologies, so as you are the users, you provide the information. So when you provide those information, you need to be kind of thoughtful which information or which photos, which things you provide to them, and which is not provide to them. So obviously, if we want to identify emotions, there should be a lot of pictures with those emotional kind of activities. So that my personal view on that question is yes. So it may violate your privacy. So that not a problem of this technology company who provide the service. I personally feel it's a problem of you, because you are the people who are posting those photos. So when you post the photos or whatever to the cyberspace, you have to think twice. Why? Because in the cyberspace, there are no delete button. So some people think you post this, and then if you don't want, you can remove that. It's not so. So after you post it, first thing, those companies, even though you say delete, they are not deleting it. They are just not giving it to you back. The second, some other social networking company or some of your friends or maybe a search engine may take a copy of those, and they will be cached kind of forever. So I personally feel we should not post the pictures to the network, private pictures, kind of like a personal matters, like emotional pictures kind of things, we should not post to the social networks. So I feel some people posting the pictures where even just look at those pictures, everybody feel this is kind of not a good picture to post it. Because when you post something on the internet, it's a public. Public means anybody can see that. Even you think it's only you share with your friends. So that is for this particular moment. Maybe someone may hack into the system. Maybe that company may, without your knowledge, even you have the license agreements and so on, without your knowledge, they may sell it. Without your knowledge, they may use those photos for the AI, as they said, the mining task. So because of that, the young students here, I advise, so be careful when you use social networks, especially posting images, because they might use for the purpose which they not supposed to. So then my personally conclusion of this question is, yes, it's kind of violate the privacy.
Which means we cannot totally rely on artificial intelligence when it comes to these kind of issues.
So the artificial intelligence will continue on the data sets. So these data sets usually provided by the end users. So if end users think about not to provide that, then in the future I don't think that will work, kind of.
Thank you, Dr. Kasun. And the next question would be to Mr. Jayanta. To which extent should we allow private businesses to utilize technologies to detect inappropriate materials?
Sorry, in terms of to what extent we will allow the private entities to detect?
Private businesses to utilize technologies to detect inappropriate materials.
Well, that's a bit of a, that's a very interesting question, no doubt. It's very general in the context of allowing private organizations to do analytics in a way, right? Business organizations to look at the
Private businesses.
to look at the
To utilize technologies to detect inappropriate materials. To which extent should we allow private
inappropriate behavior. Now, when you say detect inappropriate behavior, inappropriate behavior in Sri Lanka will not be inappropriate in another country. Or appropriate behavior here will be inappropriate behavior in another country. So it all depends from in what country's context this should be looked at, and whether a private entity can be hired by a social media platform or some other entity to look at what constitutes inappropriate behavior. Some of the largest social media platforms, even those who are originating from Asia Pacific region, from the large countries in Asian region, are known to be hiring private entities to do systematic intelligence of behavior patterns based on a certain criteria that originates from a particular country. So for example, we had in our country a scenario 1.5 years ago where social media platforms were galvanized or used as a channel for for incitement to violence, racist posting and that kind of stuff. Now, in that kind of situation, there was actually a violent crime, incitement to violence, all constituting criminal behavior. And it was not possible for my agency and the law enforcement agency to detect and take down, and we had to go into a social media blackout for a few days because of the fact that we wanted to create an analytical platform to assess the situation. Now, in that scenario, some operators provided tools that came from private sector hired entities outside Sri Lanka to do analytics based on certain parameters that were set by us and our law enforcement team that would constitute wrongful behavior. So it all depends how the permissions are given. Who authorizes it? Is it through a court order, or is it through a governmental request to a social media platform that facilitates that? All depends on the norms and the conditions that constitute misbehavior or wrongful behavior as defined by the laws of respective countries. And to conclude that point, what I want to emphasize is that internationally this has become a challenge because all these social media platforms that we use and which are to our advantage also don't originate from our part of the world. They originate from the Western hemisphere. It's their origin. So their social norms tend to be the community standards, but sometimes they customize it to a local scenario based on what constitutes wrongful behavior in a country. So some platforms have been very adaptive, but what I have to say is there is no international set guideline, and this subject is evolving. And in that context, I think that question is very good. Thank you.
And moving on to the next question, and that would be for Professor Priyanjali rather. This is regarding between internet addiction and underlying psychiatric disorders, which comes first, which leads to other?
Well, internet addiction disorder is not considered a disorder up to now, but they're considering it making it a disorder. So for example, the addictions that we have as a disorder is alcohol use, tobacco, dangerous drugs like heroin, and we also have gambling as a behavioral addiction. So now they are considering making internet use as well as gaming also an addiction if you go beyond a particular number of hours, but they are considering it. Why are they considering it still? Because they don't know whether it is a symptom of a mental illness or whether it is an illness. So this question, there is still no answer. Mental health professionals like psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists, in related professions, we are still going to do research to find out whether if your use of internet for so many hours, if you can't live without internet connection, if you're thinking and dreaming about an internet connection, and if you get kind of withdrawal symptoms when you don't have internet connection, whether you can be diagnosed as a mental illness and whether you should go in for treatment. We still don't know whether it's that or whether if you have depression or anxiety, then you go into internet, and that is a symptom of a mental illness. So there is no answer to this yet.
All right, and moving on to another question by the group number 5, and this will be to Dr. Kazun Dizoisa. What's the current law enforcement regarding punishment of the production and consumption of child abuse materials respectively, and how effective is it?
Okay, actually should go to Jayanta. He's a lawyer. I should get a technical questions.
Right, we'll move on to Dr. Jayant then.
So this is about punishment, yes.
Yes, the law enforcements
Punishment for?
regarding punishment of the production and consumption of child abuse materials.
Yeah, so very interestingly, that question comes at a time when Sri Lanka was in the process of amending the law, when there was a change recently in the government, and I hope they will take those laws forward. We have at the moment laws pending in Parliament dealing with new offences created with regard to child abuse material and that kind of abusive, revenge porn and that kind of area. We have got laws in place. We have got laws before Parliament, not yet in place, yet to be enacted, and those criminalize and impose strict penalties. But in terms of mere possession of such material, the law is such that there is, I think, a criminal penalty of 5 years imprisonment. But I think that law is not yet approved by Parliament. But what I can emphasize is that we have another law in 2006, which was enforced fairly strictly recently, requiring all internet cafes to ensure, internet providers to ensure, and internet cafes and those who provide even internet service in a university, to make sure that that service is not used for the purposes of promoting or obtaining child pornography related material. So we have laws, and there is a criminal penalty of 3 to 5 year duration that is possible to be imposed by court upon conviction. So merely providing a service or facilitating the providing of a service is deemed to be an offense in that area, but mere possession of material, that law is still pending Parliament.
Thank you, and getting to Dr. Kazun Dizoisa, and this would be on a safety concern. How can the information security of patients acquired through the telehealth be guaranteed?
Okay, so question is about kind of how do you after the collect the information from telehealth or medical hospitals or whatever, how do we guarantee that so that is may not misuse, right? So basically, as you may aware, there are cryptographic technologies available, the mathematical methods, what we call it as cryptography, available. There we could convert those information to the unreadable formats, what we call it as encrypted data or the cipher data. So we could store them in the encrypted format in those databases or the data storages. And then in the database levels, we could make sure we could give correct access rights to those correct people. Not only that, we could provide the better authentication mechanisms to access those systems. Usually the present we do usernames and the passwords, but there are more advanced authentication techniques, what we call as two-factor authentications, three-factor authentications, and so on. So we could provide them. In order to provide those security measurements, first of all, when we collect the information, we need to categorize them into the levels of kind of confidentiality, like which data is more important or confidential, which is unclassified kind of categories. So then we should not apply the technology blindly to protect all the information. Instead, we categorize them and apply the more security measurements to more classified information, and so on. So obviously there are technologies to make sure after someone gather your medical data to protect it in this medical databases. There are special research areas going on, medical health or medical informatics, security on medical health informatics and health data. So especially maybe some of you know in the Europe they have recently introduced a privacy law called GDPR, where they are very concerned on that. So if some institute collect your data and somehow for some hacker, let's say some hacker get into these systems in that hospital and take it that, so the total responsibility now goes to the organization. So if organization collect the information, so organization should get the responsibility and all the technology measures to protect it. If not, they have to pay a huge fine. Otherwise, they should not collect it. Other thing what we recommend as a technology experts, so after we collect the data, we should not keep that forever. So we have to think about which data need which medical information, which need to preserve, and which one we don't need. So the data we don't need, immediately we have to kind of erase or kind of dispose or not to store. So that's what we should do. So that's also covered by this GDPR. It clearly say you should not store the data forever for anybody. So we keep the data as we need it. After that, we erase it, remove that.
Well, with that, we conclude the panel discussion on well-being in the cyber age. I would like to thank Professor Priyanjali Soisa, Clinical Psychologist, Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo, and Mr. Jayantha Fernando, Chairman of National Center for Cyber Security, Director in Legal Advisor on ICT, and Dr. Kazun Soisa, Senior Lecturer of University of Colombo School of Computing, for joining and probably getting you the technical know-how when it comes to the well-being in this cyber age. Not just the technical know-how, but what you were in, like the questions that you raised in your group discussions. Probably hope that you received the answers that you were seeking for. So thank you once again, Professor, Dr. and Mr. Jayantha as well, for joining it. Thank you.
If the panelists could remain on stage for a moment to receive their tokens of appreciation.
And first to Professor Priyanjali D'Souza, clinical psychologist, Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo. Then to Mr. Jayantha Fernando, Chairman of the National Center for Cybersecurity. Dr. Kazun D'Souza, Senior Lecturer of University of Colombo School of Computing, for joining the panel discussion. Thank you once again.